In this section, I want to talk about the embarrassment of mechanisms linking natural resources, their various characteristics that we talked about in the last section, to the types of human security challenges and conflict that we've covered already so far this semester. And there really are an embarrassment of mechanisms. I think Humphreys does, as well as anyone that I've seen, along with the Ross article, narrowed focus on oil as any, in trying to look at the difficulty in really empirically telling the difference between different explanations for conflict that we've seen so far in this class. So the natural resources arguably can affect conflict differently than regime or institutional quality. And I think we're going to see in the readings and the discussion and in the cases that while petroleum resources have a particularly dramatic effect in the last 100 years, and we can talk about the implications of that if we do move beyond a dependence on natural resources. A couple of years ago, everyone was talking about peak oil and what that might mean for different countries that depend on resource production, but there's always other resources that are produced. Resources can affect conflict in ways different from political institutions. The readings that we saw for today found the effects are non-monotonic, that you have that kind of U-shaped relationship we've seen so far in this class, that you have or inverted U, that the probability of conflict is higher in those ones that are in the middle, because ones that have, like Saudi Arabia, a really strong supply of resource rents, they can buy either public goods or military capacity to make conflict not realistic, and countries that just don't have any natural resource extraction also don't have any kind of incentive to make that a salient point, because there just isn't any of those things around, and where the resource actually occurs matters. There have been a number of secessionist conflicts. The Cabinda one in Angola is one that comes to mind, in which you have a little bit of territory that's farther away from the rest of the country that has a discrete and highly valuable resource base that can lead to people trying to break off from the country and to try to create their own country. So where things happen, also resources that are farther away from the capital, or where there isn't the infrastructure to be able to make sure that the resource production process is transparent, that resource rents, none falls off of the back of the truck on the way it actually gets to port, can also matter. Katanga region in far southeastern Democratic Republic of Congo would be an example of this, and we're going to look at diamond mines in Sierra Leone as well, that you have resources in relatively peripheral areas can be easier to manipulate, though, and those. It also depends on remoteness as to whether it's easy for people to be able to control or to attack. Offshore oil drilling facilities, like in Cabinda, or with the new natural gas off the coast of Mozambique, can be harder to people to physically control, though often some of the production connections to the coast can be more subject to attack. So what are the different reasons for connecting natural resources to the kind of conflict dynamics that we care about? Humphreys listed, I think this is the most complete list, which is why I base it on Humphreys' list of connections to both conflict onset and conflict duration. In this class, we often talk a lot about what makes conflict start, the greed and grievance mechanisms, that kind of thing, but we focus less on the dynamics of conflict duration. 20 years ago, there was more of a discussion about conflicted economies and how they can provide a self-perpetuating cycle that can make conflict last longer. So what are the conflict mechanisms that Humphreys talks about? greedy rebels natural resources in an area, and the resource rents that they generate are a tempting target for rebel entrepreneurs to try to seize control of the resource, and because of economic incentives can attract foot soldiers as well. Greedy outsiders. My intersection of comparative politics and international relations really focuses on how international actors affect domestic political stability. This is another reason why I really enjoy this topic. So you have international corporations or governments can come in the case of the Congo in the 19th, early 20th century, you have a country owned by one individual, King Leopold. The country ended up taking it away from him. But you have these greedy outsiders trying to come get the resources. Back then it was rubber, but now it's minerals, right, in Katanga and elsewhere. But international corporations or people or governments coming from the outside can provide incentives to support rebel groups. I think I have a screenshot a bit later on, but in Congo Brazzaville, this French oil company, ELF, helped fund a rebel group to take over the government in exchange for resource contracts. I think 30 corporate executives ended up being convicted for that, and there's a lot of other examples of extractive corporations trying to strike deals. Michael Ross has his unpublished paper on booty futures, where greedy outsiders provide startup funds in exchange for preferential access to resources after the fact. The findings for that aren't as strong in the comparative studies that we're looking at today. But greedy outsiders can take advantage of politically weak areas to try to extract resources. Citizen and elite grievances, right? How the pie is divided can lead to grievances that if you have a resource that's disproportionately going to a specific segment of the population, that can lead to those not in that chosen group, whether they're elite level or citizen level, lead grievances that can motivate conflict. I already talked about booty futures. The feasibility, startup costs overlap with that greedy outsiders mechanism. Weak states, Fearon and Leighton, 2003 argument that resources are connected to conflict because states don't have the capacity to either use the rents productively and prevent corruption. Weak states don't have the ability to control the territory and enforce the rule of law in these areas that have resources, which increase the opportunity for violent actors to, including those that often come from segments of the government, to act. And sparse trading networks, that these countries that depend on a specific resource might not have those kind of connections to be able to maximize the bargaining position that they might have to gain more of these resources for themselves. Other links to conflict duration, you see different kind of factors determining whether the conflict starts at all versus how long they occur. Natural resources can increase the feasibility of longer conflicts because rebels might be able to control a resource. Sierra Leone export diamonds. Colombia, FARC ended up started as an ideological movement, but then had to find enough money to be able to continue fighting, and so started to get involved in the drug trade, so that can affect conflict duration as well. Military balance, resources can buy you a lot of weapons. We're going to see that in the Saudi Arabian case in a minute, but the findings suggest that the outcomes of conflicts that do have resources involved often end quicker and lead with a military end up with a military victory for one side or the other, and that is often because of those international interventions down at the bottom here. Natural resources can end up with a lack of cohesiveness of rebel groups, increased fractionalization, also the government. Side rent payments can affect how long the conflict lasts because there's conflict is an inherent contest of who has the legitimate right to use force or control over a specific territory. And so if you can buy off acquiescence of different groups or different actors, that might also affect how long a conflict lasts. And just conflicts with resource areas are more likely to lead to international interventions because companies who produce these resources often export them to countries that would find it difficult to change sources for a particular resource, and that can provide increased incentives for countries to intervene themselves, or for countries to go through the international community, like through the UN Security Council, to start interventions or to support interventions in areas in order to try to bring the peace. So international interventions are much higher in areas where there are natural resources, and that can shorten the duration of conflict. Other potential explanations for the relationship between conflict and natural resources. Declining rents can cause conflict. We see that with Venezuela, when the price of oil declined, there hasn't been full-scale conflict, but these declining rents could lead to an opportunity for opposition groups to act. Also, there's endogeneity, spuriousness, and levels versus change dynamics that as the risk of conflict increases, resource rents can decrease. Corporations have there's a number of products that produce country risk ratings that calculate how risky it is to do business in particular countries. Often countries that are riskier for conflict have to pay higher rates for international lending. I have a paper with a couple of co-authors that looked at how much countries pay on the international bond market to buy bonds as a prediction for conflict. So that can lead to risk of endogeneity, that as your risk of conflict goes up, your other service-based sectors or manufacturing sectors can move their services abroad. That makes you more likely to be dependent on natural resources. And so when conflict does break out, you think the arrow is going from resources to conflict, but it's actually also an arrow going the other way, that conflict has affected the country's dependence on natural resources, which is why it's important with how that flow is normalized, right? Is it a percentage of GDP or a percentage of exports? So if all exports go down and resources go down, then that wouldn't have the same relationship as if it's a percentage of the entire GDP. So spuriousness, government weakness, could lead to both resource rents dependence and conflict risk. That weak states, right, with the Collier, the Furon and Leighton approach that say that weak states provide an opportunity for conflict because they can't enforce their monopoly on the use of force all over the country. That could also lead to a dependence on natural resources. That if the government doesn't have the strength to encourage private sector investment, create opportunity zones, or encourage diversification of the economy, that could be what's really driving both conflict. If the country can't buy and provide services for people, that could make it lead to grievances leading to conflict, but then it could also lead to a dependence on resources because they don't have the capacity to diversify away from natural resources. The last thing is it really the overall dependence on a particular resource, or how much that dependence has changed year on year, right? Or the price. Does the amount of rents as the overall level, or how much it's changed year on year, matters, right? I think more articles kind of assume it's about levels, but often we see the triggers with changes over time. But it's often harder to measure these kind of dips or changes than it is levels. So I think most of the research has focused on levels rather than change. So yeah, those are a lot of different kind of causal mechanisms, and I know some of the students in this class are focusing on natural resources and conflict, and I think the takeaway from this section should be that it depends, your approach to try to connect natural resources and conflict depend on what kind of resource you're talking about, when you're looking at, who the relevant actors are, um, um, where you're looking at countries that depend on a particular type of resource at a particular time period. Oil wasn't really salient until the 1930s. Other resources like bat guano was more important for fertilizer until artificial fertilizer was developed. Rubber, as I mentioned, in Democratic Republic of Congo before synthetic rubber was developed. So are you really talking about what governments are doing, what other elites are doing, what opposition groups are trying to take advantage of, international actors? There's a profusion of mechanisms, and I think this is an attempt to try to show the extent of those different mechanisms, and then we can try to narrow our focus through a particular case or a particular research question on a specific type of that to really see how this kind of causal process plays along.